Good evening, and welcome to episode 28 of Screentone Club, your bi-weekly manga podcast. My name is Elliot Page, and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How are you doing, Andy?
I am here to hijack this podcast to talk about the Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0 teaser, and nobody can stop me.
What? No! Ah! Yeah, I'm just going to make noises for another half an hour while I torment myself with wanting to watch that thing.
I mean, to be fair, that is going to be my discussion of those 10 minutes, is just me making noises, because that's pretty much the only coherent kind of, thoughts I can assemble about it at this point in time. So,
I mean, to be fair, I've watched... Sorry.
I was very tempted to not watch it. It's like, no, it would be great to go in cold to the final movie, but I'm not strong-willed enough for that. So as soon as it was happening, it's like, oh no, I need to see this.
Yeah, I think at this point I've been without new Evangelion or 4.0, whatever the hell it's called, for so long that at this point I might as well just carry on. Also because I fear that if I get my whistle wetted by this trip teaser, I may in fact just flat out go bonkers.
Yeah, I mean that is definitely the risk. Also, watching in kind of Japanese with French subtitles is a weird kind of mind-melting experience of two languages I know a little bit of. It kind of merged together. My brain doesn't really know what to do or what to translate, and I kind of end up in just a puddle of mush when it comes to actually trying to figure things out.
Plus, it's even funnier when you try and translate both of them and then go, well, I'm not sure which of these is, oh god, help. What? One of these is localized, the other one is, uh-oh. Your brain just starts to go a bit funny. Yeah,
my only saving grace is I suspect even if I knew both of those languages fluently, I still wouldn't really know what was going on, so everything's fine.
And you're not supposed to anyway, so
exactly.
There you go. Great. So yeah, this is being recorded on the 9th of July 2019. Likely to come out tomorrow because I need to edit it. Bit delayed because of field trips, which I'll get to in a second. Much more importantly, a quick note is that this podcast is officially our 1 year anniversary of doing the podcast. Woo! We haven't planned anything special for a 1 year anniversary because, I don't know, in my case, it's like the fourth podcast I've gotten to a year on. So this is kind of not really all that big a deal anymore.
Yeah. Please insert your own off-brand happy birthday song here.
Yeah, I'm not going to edit one in. I'm sorry, I really can't be bothered. But I will probably put an image in the header of the podcast for a laugh. But more importantly, thank you to everyone who's listening to this, whether you've just picked this episode up just for the hell of it, or if you've been listening since the start, or you chipped in wherever. It's all meant the world to us. Thank you very much, especially to, unsurprisingly, our patrons who have flat out kept this podcast running. And, I've had friends say, oh, why do you kill yourself for so quote unquote little money every month? I'm like, well, that money is the direct stuff that keeps me going and doing this podcast in a more aggressive fashion because, as lame as it sounds, people are actually putting hard money down to listen to me say stupid things. And so, damn it, I'm going to do that, whether they want it or not, which they've shown they do. So this circular argument is going nowhere. Anyway, thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. And also, frankly, everyone who listens anyway. Thank you to all of you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Also, as a quick note, those who do in fact give us money at the $3 and up tier, please make sure to get your votes in for our bonus episode, which you can do if you support us on Patreon. Everyone who supports us gets the bonus episodes, but only those who chuck in $3 get to vote. If you have your vote, use it. Vote early, vote often, because at the moment we have a strange split, which would be nice to resolve because using random.org is getting boring. Also on Patreon business, a shout out to Rob Jessup. Once again, thank you for helping fund us and flat out paying the posting fees. So, moving on. We normally have the section on returning champions, but at the moment we don't have any. I still need to read volume 3 of Voynich Hotel. Insert prostrations here, I guess. But I do have a trip report as threatened at the start, which is also why I delayed recording the podcast. Sorry, Andy. I skipped down to London to go to Japan House in Kensington, to go and see the This Is Manga exhibition on Naoki Urasawa, which was in the basement of Japan House. First and foremost, getting to Kensington is a pig and a half because it's on the other side of London from where I live. And so I had to get a procession of, tube trains there. And then I went to see a friend who was also on the other side of London. And for a city as well connected, it's a nightmare to get anywhere, unsurprisingly, but not as bad as New York at the moment. But anyway, I went to the exhibition, which was free, fully free. It's still available to the end of the month. It's small, but perfectly formed, very well lit. It is, as mentioned, in the basement, and it has basically selections and discussions of all of Urasawa's major works, including Urawa and Happy, which are sports manga, basically. You can still obviously see the telltale art he has, and also 20th Century Boys, Monster, and some other newer works that haven't quite made it over to the UK, including Billy Bat. And yeah, it was quite a nice, small but perfectly formed exhibition, like all killer, no filler. It also had like a small video of basically a speed draw on the wall by Urasawa, and also little surprise drawings around the exhibition space and in Japan House itself. Like there was a small bat that was flapping and saying hello as I went into the toilet, which was a good laugh. So yeah, if you want to see original sort of like storyboards and drawings from Urasawa, then it's got those in spades. It even has some early works, including an anthology he drew when he was 8, which is kind of adorable. Also, you look at it and think, damn, when I was 8, I was like picking my nose and buying football stickers. But yeah, it's a very good exhibition. I recommend it. It definitely is worth its price of free if you can get to Kensington. Yeah, there's one thing that I kind of pointed out because I'm the pedant ass that I am, is that it had a map, like a map of where Urasawa's works are published. It was supposed to show like the global reach of Urasawa and, you know, his sort of pan-global and pan-national sort of interest. But all it did to me was annoy me with how the fact of like no country had all of his stuff available. And for example, that if you wanted to read all of his works totally in aggregate, you'd have to jump around mainland Europe quite a lot and learn at least 3 languages. So again, that's me being an arse, but it is slightly irritating to look at the map and go, fucking Luxembourg, why do they get fucking Billy Bat? What the fuck? So yeah.
I mean, you'd like to think, given that they had him like there at the opening for like a kind of Q&A evening, that somebody very pointedly showed him that chart and kind of like whispered in his ear, like, imagine if all this was available digitally to everybody everywhere. And he's like, yes, you're right. I see the error of my ways. But that probably didn't happen.
Well, the problem is that from what I gather, don't want to put words in his mouth, obviously. And also I haven't watched the fullness of that interview, but from what I gather, he is not the biggest fan of digital manga and has a hard stop on it. He has talked before about, he is very much a person who honors the page as the unit of a comic, like almost more so than the panel. And you see that in the exhibition where like a large part of the exhibition talks about the importance of motion, of human motion, of flicking through pages to get to the next one, to get to the next one, to get to the next one, to see what happens. Which especially is helpful when you do quite a lot of high tension and thriller style works, as Urasawa does. And it's that kind of drive that pushes you through his works, Monster in particular, because that's one I have the most affinity for. But there's a large amount of web comics which are basically vertical scrolling and just endless vertical scrolling you get nowadays, where each panel is basically one phone screen's height. And so, he has a certain distaste, or like a personal dislike of those, I suppose. As a quick note, friend of the podcast, Matt Carman, did the interviewing on that opening night. So good on Matt Carman. And it was kind of annoying that was the first I'd heard of that, and I was going to a different podcast recording. So it's like, damn it. I wish I could split myself in half and stick my other half into this interview to see what's being said. But as I say, from what I gather, the author is not a fan of digital rights or digital manga. His work's being made available digitally, even to narrow it down and be exact. And frankly, if that's his edict, then you can't really go against that because he has author's right, especially given how his contracts are stipulated. So I can moan, but at this, I have to kind of suck it up. And the reason why I started my stupid like cut manga up and scan them thing was to digitize my copies of Monster, because it was monstrously large on my bookshelf. Sorry for the easy joke.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess my kind of one question about this particular exhibition is like, was it very much geared towards people who already know and like the author and his works, or is it possibly an entry point for somebody like, shamefully myself, who's not actually read any of his stuff? Like, is there still an interest there in terms of like, an introduction to this artist and like why he's important, or how does that kind of pan out?
Sorry, I cut you off. Yes, I think it also this is going to sound mean, but it did an easier and better and more effortless job of introducing just what manga is in general, rather than taking the rather belabored historical approach that the British Museum exhibition did. So when you get down there, the first thing you see is, hey, this is a picture of Urusawa, this is how he got into it, this is what manga is, this is a very brief and very clipped expression of where it comes from and the importance of manga in Japan and the worldwide reach it now has, and we're just going to leave that there and not delve into it or overdo it, and now we're going to show you a whole heap of original drawings. And also, I think very smartly, it started right off with Pluto. Sadly, you were unable to take photos of the actual original storyboards because I probably would have taken pictures of every single one of the Pluto ones because, oh damn, I love Pluto. But I took pictures of everything else, the wall art, things you're allowed to take pictures of. So yeah, I think it was honestly a good introduction to his works. And also, if you're a fan of his works, a good sort of wider range of his works, and also you get to see the works you've already come to read and you can see the originals from them, so it's kind of a nice thing. If anything, it just kind of makes it more annoying that we don't have Yawara, the judo girl manga, which looks amazing, and they're showing it on a week by week basis in the exhibition, and I'm just like, damn, I love sports manga, I love female fighting manga, I want to read this judo manga. Is it available? No. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of only hope that this kind of exhibition, like if it generates interest, in the West, whether that will help, move the needle on some of this stuff. Because, we certainly exist in a time where it feels like there's space in a market for pretty much anything manga-based. Like, if you pitch it right and you kind of put it in the right places and promote it in the right ways, then you can justify it. And so you'd like to think that, things being as they are, and with, Olympics in Tokyo next year, maybe there will be an opportunity for somebody to come out, even digital argument regardless, to say, hey, here's an opportunity to do something interesting with that. I mean, much like coming out of Japan Expo and Anime Expo, more specifically, talk that all of Atomo's stuff is going to be getting, Western releases and kind of, getting some love. I wonder whether there is an opportunity there for somebody to do likewise with Urasawa and some of the stuff that's kind of filling some of those holes that you mentioned.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there was a mention in the information around Uara saying that, hey, when this came out, it was around the Barcelona 92 Olympics and it caused a giant surge in people learning judo, especially women. And it's like, that's cool. The one thing, looking at AX and the license announcements by various publishers, the thing I worry about is it looks like a lot of publishers, and this is way pie in the sky Elliot prediction, so I'm not saying this is accurate, I don't have industry sources, I'm just speculating. But a lot of the stuff you see there is low risk, low reward, low yield type stuff where they're not licensing big names. They may be leaning into existing franchises or spin-offs on franchises that they can grab. But a lot of publishers don't appear to be taking on big names and big works. It's mostly sort of, oh, there's some fandom buzz around this. If we take a bath on it, it won't kill us because it's not going to take a lot to license and then release because it's short, or we can manage it. Maybe that's just me extrapolating too much from the recent event, but nearly everything that came out as being licensed to AX, I was like, oh, this is... I mean, sure, there's a market, it's totally a demonstrable market for this, but it's not a very large thing you're going for here. So, who knows? But the Otomo thing is totally great. There was a copy of the Akira Collector's Edition at Japan House, but it was £175, both in weight and money. So I left it on the shelf.
Yeah, fair play for that.
One last thing to note about this exhibition as well, actually, it's a travelling exhibition. It started in Japan, went to Los Angeles, and is now in London. So it's jumped around a few cities. So the fact it was in LA is perhaps even bigger sign that, Urasawa is getting an international sort of play, and hopefully this will lead to something.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
But yeah, if you can get to Kensington to Japan House, I fully recommend it. As I say, it's free. Once you're done, you can then run away somewhere else and get a cup of tea or something, make a day of it. You're in London. But yeah, it's totally worthwhile if you can get there. I must admit, even coming from my very close environment, it was still £26 return train ticket, which was woof.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just getting cheap in my old age. Who knows? But anyway, that's the exhibition wrap up.
Cool.
So I think I've gabbed a bit too much. So Andy, I'd like it if you talked a little now. Would you like to talk about your pick for this week?
Sure, yeah. So Yeah, so as we mentioned, introducing this stuff at the tail end of the episode, and as I kind of gave us an excuse to segue into it at the start of this, we're kind of a little bit Evangelion themed this week, and my pick was something that I'd been meaning to read forever, and kind of the whole Evangelion discussion and discourse kind of gave me a really good excuse to finally go and read Insufficient Direction, which is a one-shot work by Moeko Anno, who, as the surname suggests, is Hideaki Anno's wife. Now, this manga makes it very clear on the very first page, this is completely a work of fiction. It is not at all in any way related to Moeko Anno and Hideaki Anno and their domestic life.
Even if they do, in fact, say each other's names.
Yes, indeed, and even though the afterward, which talks about the manga with Hideaki Anno, mentions like, yeah, I told her to put that in there because I thought it was really funny, which I did really enjoy. Like, that was a good laugh out loud moment of just like knowing what I was getting into. And page one is just the usual disclaimer of like, no, there's no relation to anybody. But anyway, it's basically Moeko Anno's kind of point of view, which she kind of imagines herself as Rompers, this kind of like oversized baby who just kind of rocks around this entire manga. But it's basically about kind of her relationship with Hideaki Anno and more specifically as they kind of move into married life together. And in a sense, this is kind of, it's not really a subversion, that's not really the right word, but it kind of, this is the kind of story that you see kind of fictionalized in manga a lot, of kind of like, oh, like normal girl marries otaku guy, and, you know, here's the hilarity that ensues. Except this time around, kind of Moeko Anno is pretty much at least kind of on the cusp of sort of otaku-dom herself. Like, she's a big old nerd. She kind of like enjoys a lot of that stuff, even though she maybe doesn't kind of like identify with that directly. And kind of a lot of this book is really her just getting pulled into kind of Hideaki Anno's sphere of just being a big kind of tokusatsu and kaiju nerd, and they kind of end up just they kind of revolve around each other in that sense and play off of one another and just get kind of way deep into things that arguably as grown-ups they're not supposed to do. And it's a pretty charming kind of work overall. Like, it's one of those things that it could so easily have kind of been a series that maybe kind of felt a bit kind of nasty and mean-spirited or something like that in places, of just like, yeah, this kind of gets insufferable at times, but there's kind of something really sweet about the relationship as depicted here. Like, they both kind of recognize their own flaws and the flaws in one another kind of throughout the book. You know, they both kind of lean on each other when required sometimes, and it never really gets particularly heavy. It's all very kind of like slice of life vignettes about mostly pretty kind of low rent things, which is, you know, kind of the bulk of people's everyday life. Like, it's not all drama and exciting stuff. So yeah, I don't know. It's a pretty simple piece at the end of the day. Like, it entertains me. Like, the otaku references kind of wear a bit thin quite early on, I found. Like, there's only so much you can wring out of that before it feels like you're seeing kind of the same things play out over and over again. I think at the end of it, in a weird way, kind of one of the most satisfying things that you get out of it as somebody who's kind of like a big Evangelion nerd is this book is kind of set, you know, way after Anno worked on Evangelion and all the obvious kind of like depression and issues that he was suffering around that time, and kind of, you know, immediately subsequent to that. And so where this book is set is just kind of, it's really satisfying because it's just like, Hideaki Anno seems to be having a good time. Like, he's enjoying himself. Like, he's having cameos in weird movies with his wife and stuff, and like I think I just got a lot of enjoyment out of just seeing him seemingly living for pleasure alone and having a good time, because it's like, you know what, you deserve it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the sort of life is what you make it almost angle to it, of like, you know, at the start you've got Rompers trying to, you know, she even says at one point, is like, oh, I never really went out with a director before or anyone in the biz, even though I'm a mangaka, because I didn't want to like feel like I was getting sucked into the pool of otaku-dom, and I'm trying to become a good otaku wife. And obviously her best victories come when she's not worried about that and is just like there's a section where she ends up like just starting to get up with Hideaki to watch like Sunday morning tokusatsu shows at 7:30 or whatever the hell. And it's kind of this adorable cute thing of like, oh, we're adults, but who says we are not allowed to do things we like? There's even like a single panel which is the explicit, well, we were denied these things as kids and we've made a living in it, and so now no one can stop us from buying entire manga series, DVD box sets and laserdiscs. Sod it. So it's very much a case of like, well, no, I get to decide the terms of my adulthood, and while I may acquiesce sometimes to my parents' wishes, like, I don't know, having a wedding, I'm still perfectly fine with doing all this stuff and going through normal stuff. Like, one of us gets ill. Both of us have these weird sort of predilections. Like Mayoko Anno has this weird fascination with, like fortune telling, which I feel like she herself knows is stupid, but at the same time buys into it. And so it's very much a case of like, yeah, probably shouldn't eat this weird fruit, but watch me eat it. So that kind of helps. But yeah, the otaku references are very, very deep and wide, and the reference notes at the back are intense. I feel like if you are deep cut tokusatsu nerd, you will totally love them. But if after very, very quickly, it's much easier just to let them sleep, just to slough off of you, frankly. Because otherwise it's going to drive you nuts. Keep going back to the notes at the back of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the nice things about this book. Once you kind of scrape off that whole layer of kind of like, hey, look, here are all the nerd references, is like there is a very genuine and a very real sense of kind of how relationships work, especially when you're living with somebody where you do kind of just end up, whether it's kind of like deliberately or you just kind of fall into it, your habits do end up kind of rubbing off on one another, and your interests kind of start to weirdly coalesce sometimes in strange ways. And I think that there's some really nice examples of that. Like you say, they're getting up early on Sunday morning. Like there's a great little skit where they end up going to some posh hotel where they have like, a chauffeur that or a valet or whatever that takes the car around to park it for them, and they're like, oh no, we just had like Ultraman songs on the CD and player and we didn't turn it off, like we're totally going to get judged for that. And it's these weird little moments where like things that maybe, one individual in that relationship wouldn't have done on their own, because the other person's way into it, you just kind of end up like falling into being into it as well. And I think there are some really great moments from kind of like the author's perspective of just like, yeah, I wasn't really I never really cared that much about this stuff, but like somehow from being around somebody who's really passionate about it, I just sort of just fell into really liking it as well.
Yeah, no, I have a friend who recently moved in with his long-term sort of partner, and when they started going out, each of them had one guitar, and now they're living together. They have 5 guitars in the house, and they're not quite sure where the extra 3 came from. I think there's a 6th one coming. Like it's almost like some kind of fucking like extended family of babies, but instead they just keep buying guitars. So yeah, that sort of stuff just happens where you just kind of accelerate because you've got someone to share your interests with, which is kind of nice because it just shows them like fully enjoying what they do, even if it leads to some friction on the more basic terms. And there is a pretty good bit where Rompers worries that she's been lowering her standards for flat out base hygiene because her husband has just worn her out. Which I think is also partially why it has the whole thing at the front saying, hey, not a real person, honest. But, I feel like there is this kind of loving care that goes both ways in it, especially if you read the like interview at the back with Hideaki Anno. And, Rompers like Mayoko Anno from the start, just deigning to like for like making it expressive and kind of amusing, like making herself a weird oversized baby in a romper outfit. Really helps take any kind of edge out of it and just makes it kind of lighthearted from the get-go. And of course, anyone else who is not the pair of them is drawn perfectly normally. So it's just the pair of them in this weird little sort of like pot belly director and tiny baby shouty girl combi.
Yeah. I mean, the illustrations really help to kind of like, you know, to make that comedy work. I mean, I feel like especially around like Hideaki Anno himself, like the moments of sort of physical comedy where he's just like goofing around doing Ultraman poses and whatever, like all of that stuff just plays really well with kind of that character design, and you know that the whole look just really kind of accentuates all of that stuff. And yeah, like I think both of those characters being designed the way they are, it kind of just makes all of that stuff work a lot better than it would had you done pretty much anything else with them. Like it does really aid the whole thing.
Yeah, it really helps as well that it's like 19 extremely short, like 5 to 6 page chapters, quote unquote chapters, and there's no real storyline. Like it's just a bunch of omake. It's basically like taking like 20 different omake chapters at the end of other volumes and slapping them all together, because it takes place over like a 4-year period, I think, going by the names that pop up at different points, and as their house gets more and more full of shit. Frankly, you start to notice it even in the art itself. You're like, wait, there's more stuff now. But yeah, it slowly sort of accrues over a long period. So that's kind of really nice, where it's just a bunch of small looks or things that were useful. I mean, halfway through, you know, Miyoko Anno herself says, "Oh, am I getting ground down or used to this? Because I can't think of anything else weird to write about now." So it's like a chapter of soul searching of like, oh no, what's happened? Have I gotten too used to this? So
yeah, and even again, that's one of those points where, like, you know, it could have taken a more malicious turn, but like even when like the author's clearly kind of expressing like exasperation at her husband and at things he's done, or more often than not done, like there's still that kind of, it is like again a very familiar kind of long-term relationship thing of things where there are things the other person does that drives you nuts on one level, but at the same time there comes a point where you just kind of like shrug it off and just like, yeah, okay, I'm used to that now. That's the way that person is, and that's not going to change, and it's cool. Like that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna roll with that.
I feel like there's a few points of that in the manga where like Rompers says, "Hey, you know you do this weird dumb thing, right?" And you know, Director Kun goes, "Huh?" And you know, he didn't know that it was not completely and utterly perfectly normal, which is always what happens with those sort of things. It's like when you mispronounce a word for your entire life, and then someone eventually corrects you, and you go, sure." The thing you said, I'm going to leave this room now and hide in shame because I've been saying this wrong for 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. But no, like I very much enjoyed this. Like, I mean, I of course, like with the Evangelion stuff, kind of as it is, I think I'm definitely on a big kind of like thinking about Hideaki Anno bent. Like, I mean, actually, I was on another podcast before this, also talking about Evangelion, and kind of one of the things I was talking about is like how as I've grown up with that franchise, like I've come to realize so much more about kind of not just kind of the mental state of Anno at that time and kind of what that meant for the series, but also just like the guy's talent, like as a filmmaker, like, you know, his grasp of cinematography and framing and stuff like that. And it's, I know, like I found myself wanting to kind of like explore kind of his life and his body of work in a fuller way now that I'm older. And I feel like, you know, this is a pretty a kind of, you know, frivolous part of it, but it's kind of still just like an important kind of glimpse into his life and his mindset and his influences and kind of what drives him. And I think, you know, this isn't like the most amazing manga in the world. It's not the most hilarious manga in the world, but if you're of a similar bent of kind of being interested in this director and, you know, him as a person and how that has influenced his work, like there's definitely something you can glean from it here. Yeah,
totally. It's not a master key by any means, but it's certainly a very useful, you know, it's a really interesting little sort of tome. So, you know, it's a pretty good little thing to have a little poking on.
Yeah. And again, if you don't want to get too deep into all the references it spits out, like you can breeze through it pretty quickly and not kind of feel like you've missed too much. Like you can go in deep and research everything and read all the translation notes and, you know, go into a real rabbit hole there, but you don't have to. Like, that was my worry when I kind of started reading this and it started getting dense with all the references of like, is like 80% of this going to pass me over unless I really dig into the translation notes? So it's like, no, not really. You don't have to engage with that stuff if you really don't feel the urge to.
Yeah, it's pretty good in that way. But yeah, one thing to know is it's available digitally. It's still on Crunchyroll, I believe. It's available physically, which I think is how you picked it up, Andy.
Yes.
And also it's appeared now in digital stores, which only just happened shortly after we announced we were going to be covering this, and it's now on Bookwalker. So that's where I got it, because I could not get the Crunchyroll manga app working on my phone. And I feel that's a common thing I hear about from people about the Crunchyroll manga service in general.
Yeah. That age-old story.
Well, yeah, more so now, because from a little bird has told me on good authority that there's just zero resource being put into that now. So if it seems like it's dying on the vine, it is. So we shall see. Hopefully I'll be proven wrong and I'll look an idiot, and I'll be perfectly glad for it.
Yeah, that would be nice.
But yeah, it's a single volume banger, so it's a one and done sort of thing, which is helpful. Do you have anything else to say on it, Andy?
No, I think that is my lot.
Okay, so moving on to our second topic for this episode. This is kind of, given we've talked about Hideaki Anno and Evangelion and all that, and we've kind of danced around it enough. As mentioned on the previous episode, I told us to go and read Volume 1 of the Neon Genesis Evangelion 3-in-1 Omnibus editions. So thanks me once again for doing this, because it was 560 pages to read. Idiot. Sorry, Andy. But I wanted to go for this because Neon Genesis Evangelion, the manga adaptation, was kind of started alongside the TV series ever so slightly, and then got stretched out to a long degree, and was only finished in like the 2010s, I think, at this point. It ran to a total of 14 volumes. It's fully complete and translated, and then it was collected into 5 omnibus volumes, of 4 of them with 3 volumes and then a 2-volume one at the end, because the last volume is long, because it basically crams in the rest of it. You can get it physically or digitally. As mentioned, the author is Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, who is the character designer of Evangelion and Nadia the Secret of Blue Water, which you can tell immediately because Shinji and Nadia are basically the same character. Published by Viz. Sadamoto, quickly as a note, also did a bunch of Evangelion art books, and generally, and actually came to AX in Los Angeles for just signings and panels and such. So he's still around. He still does stuff. He still has exactly the same sort of art style, basically with a few more bells and whistles. But I generally picked this because, and also I picked the Omnibus edition because as a single volume, the first volume is kind of on the shorter side when it comes to covering material, so I wanted the Omnibus edition to kind of get a decent block of content to talk about. And so, as a quick note to start this off with, as me and Andy have already alluded to, but for myself, Evangelion is something I've basically grown up with since I was like 16 and was in sixth form, and someone showed me a short clip off of sci-fi of Unit Zero headbutting the edge of the cage and trying to get at Gendo, and then getting sort of shut down, and I was just like, what the hell is this? I have to see it. And then I wasn't able to see it because my parents didn't have satellite, until I eventually saw it, and it has been with me ever since, and it has been a part of my personal development, and also a media sort of appreciation. Like, Evangelion is a lot to me, and for good or for ill, could argue, but it is something important to me, and I personally take a lot of stock in it and find a lot of joy in it, even revisiting it. Warts and all, frankly. Like, there's plenty you could pick apart about it, but just want to get that out there. So, this is the manga adaptation, which is both written and drawn by Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, and it's important to note that it's kind of not a shot-for-shot remake of Evangelion, the TV series. At times, it does delve into that, or dip into that level, but it is its own beast. It takes the same ideas, the same characters, the same setting, and provides its own I suppose the phrase I could use was lens on it. Like, it has Sadamoto's lens on it because, you know, they were his characters. He had the character material and drew them, and he populated this world. And it has the same sort of level of flair in the technical elements, and especially in the character elements. And it tells its own story slightly remixed, and slightly rearranged to slightly fit better in the manga sort of format. I mean, how the first volume, as such, the first 180 pages of this is the first 2 episodes of Evangelion TV series, which themselves is a self-contained unit, but straight, you know, not sort of inflated to fit the entire scope of the manga. And so it kind of follows. Actual synopsis, Shinji, Ikari Shinji, 14 years old, has been living with his uncle for 10 years because his dad basically dumped him there. The year is 2015, the far off year of 2015. And in the year 2000, there was a massive explosion on the North Pole that melted the ice caps. And was it the South Pole? I can't remember. South Pole, shit.
I think I thought it was North.
Yeah, I think so. I can't remember which. Damn it, I'm going to get called out as a fake Evangelion nerd now. But an explosion happened at one of the poles, which basically melted the entire ice cap and caused severe floodings and death and mega sort of events. And so basically culled off half of humanity and left everyone in a bit of a rough state. Year 2015, 15 years later, and now Tokyo 3, the third version of Tokyo City, is basically coming under attack by strange unknowable beings called angels, the first of which is vaguely humanoid with strange shoulder pads and a wicked sick red chest gem. And Shinji comes to Tokyo on the whim of his father basically inviting him back to his workplace, and gets picked up by this spunky sort of like female beam bandit looking gal called Misato, who then basically says, hey, yeah, we got to fight that thing, and shows him to a giant robot basically called the Evangelion, and he has to pilot it to save the world. But he's not too chuffed about it because basically he was abandoned for 10 years and has now been told, hey, come back home, my useless bastard son, now get in the robot. And it goes from there. As more angels appear, Shinji struggles with his finding a place to live still when he doesn't really want to feel or exist or interact with people or have to deal with people's expectations. And it touches on some of the sort of general themes of communication that the Evangelion TV series does, but it downplays all that stuff to multiple different degrees. But yeah, one thing I'll say is that it's very much more of an events and reactions kind of take rather than constantly being in Shinji's headspace and his personal reactions to it. As we mentioned, you know, while this was going on, Hideaki Anno put a lot of himself into this series and the themes of communication. And the manga continues some of that, but is a lot more sort of grounded and in reality world, like you don't get entire episodes put into someone's head, and kind of is lesser for it. The main difference, and I'm going to make this note and then hand off to Andy for what he thinks, but the main difference between this in terms of structure is that unless my memory is failing me, the TV series never really had characters have their internal thoughts vocalized. Like whenever someone talked about their thoughts, they were generally wrestling with them or arguing with themselves or trying to get to grips with something or having a fugue where they're trying to wrestle with something. Whereas the Evangelion manga will flat out have like Shinji making a wry face and like having a thought to himself about, oh man, Misato, she's a slob. And I don't remember the TV series having that. And if anything, it kind of makes the characters a lot less appealing on page because it kind of makes it a bit more slapsticky at the same time because it's just like, here is their thought and what they're thinking. And even if it's just a comedy sort of slapstick element going, oh, isn't she a bit of a slob, this Misato lady and her weird ass penguin who lives in her flat. But it kind of flattens the characters out and doesn't lock away their headspace anymore quite as much. Mostly with Shinji. And he's a lot more, I don't know, Shinji is both a combination of both even less outspoken, but also a lot more sort of spiteful almost in this edition, which makes him a bit more exhausting to deal with, even more so than the TV series to my mind. It's been a while since I watched Evangelion, frankly, so comparisons back and forth aren't that helpful coming from my mouth. But I will say that as a manga, reading it as it is, that is one thing that I found with it is just having it was a bit more sort of flat-faced almost in presentation, with just having characters just having their thoughts out there to you as the reader, which is for me kind of one of the things that lessens it. But at the same time, it's nice to have some of the secondary cast given more play, and it even gives Pen an origin story, which is important. Anyway, I promised I'd hand over to Andy for what he thinks of this before I ramble on forever. What did you think of this, Andy? Did you compare it as much as I did, or did you enjoy it on your own?
Yeah, I mean, again, much like you, as mentioned, I've grown up with Evangelion. I mean, literally, I wouldn't be sat here right now. I wouldn't be in the job that I am in right now if it wasn't for Evangelion. Like, it's been massively influential on my life. So, yeah, I mean, I've read this manga once before, kind of all the way through. So this is kind of like my second time of reading it. And I don't know how many times I've watched the Evangelion TV series. I have rewatched it after it hit Netflix, bar End of Evangelion, because I'm not quite ready for that yet. But
is anyone ever really?
Well, no, exactly. Like, I just need to prepare as much as humanly possible,
or just do what I did with a friend and basically dare each other to watch it while 3 drinks in.
Yeah, that's probably the way to go.
No, it's not. But I can say for sure it is not. But that's how I came to it. So there we are.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's impossible to kind of for either of us to really just kind of read this manga in a bubble. And again, like we've often said with sort of other series on here, and as I've often found, particularly with things where I've watched the anime adaptation or vice versa, like, it would be really interesting to hear the view of somebody who'd gone in and read this manga blind, who, maybe knew a bit about the anime, because I think it's impossible not to from cultural osmosis, but who, hadn't watched the entire thing. It would be really interesting to hear their thoughts of this as a standalone experience, or read this, then watch the anime, because everything about this manga, you end up comparing it to, like, well, but the TV show did it this way. And I think it's kind of swings and roundabouts for me. Like, I'm kind of with you to a certain extent about the inner monologue thing, because you're right, like, the TV series, any kind of inner consciousness in terms of kind of thought processes are, as you say, they tend to be arguments, and, they're kind of, they're not just kind of your throwaway, like, this is what I'm thinking in my head right now. They're very much, almost kind of subconscious arguments, usually while a character is asleep or unconscious or something like that, rather than the usual, like, here is what I'm thinking right now that anime tends to play with. And yeah, I think that does kind of flatten the characters to a certain extent, but I think at times it does also kind of accentuate those characters or Shinji's character in particular, as the character we really get to see that with. I think at times it does accentuate and perhaps simply just make clearer what his mental state is like. I mean, I think Shinji is kind of the focus of this first omnibus in particular. Like, this is before Asuka comes on the scene. Like, you get a bit of Rei, but this is kind of the first, like, 4 or 5 episodes of the TV series, I guess, pretty much.
First 6 or so before Asuka attacks happens. It's basically basically, to compare it to something more recent, it is the first Rebuild movie.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. And so it's very Shinji-centric. And I mean, I think Shinji's character in this manga is interesting, because I feel like, if nothing else, the obvious kind of, boring line that everybody throws up about, Shinji getting the robot is it's kind of born of the fact that I think that there is a level to that character that's difficult to read on screen. And I think particularly if you've maybe not had experience of the kind of, depression and kind of the issues that Shinji is clearly having throughout that series. Like, I think it can be easy to read him as just like sullen, grumpy teenager. And I think the one thing that this manga does quite well is it makes Shinji a more rounded character. Like, his issues are still there and they're still very apparent. And in fact, there's one kind of part of of this manga that is just very literal about kind of talking about his depressive state. Like, I mean, he basically gives an almost dictionary definition of feeling dissociation, which is like, one of the main kind of like, symptoms of depression. And like, that's a really blatant kind of like blunt instrument in terms of like, look, this is what is up with this character, and it's very overt about that. But I think it feels a bit more natural, because the Shinji in the manga is also like, he has the ability to be snarky and to kind of snap back at people like Misato. I mean, like, there's a really good comparison point is kind of like where, after the first angel attacks, like, basically Toji, one of his classmates, his sister's been injured by that attack. Like, obviously he holds Shinji responsible as the pilot of the Evangelion, and basically, like, comes up and says, like, hey, like, this is your fault. I'm gonna lamp you. I'm gonna thump you. And like, in the anime, Shinji is very passive about it. He's basically just like, yeah, do whatever you want. I don't care. Like, I'm not important. Whereas in the manga, he actually kind of gives a bit back. Like, it feels like a more natural kind of conversation, if you like, between two teenagers of just like, you're the big bully. Like, there's nothing I can do to stop this, but I'm at least going to throw kind of a barbel to your way to maybe make you feel bad about it. Yeah. And I think there are a few moments of that throughout this omnibus that just feels more like kind of Shinji as a more relatable and a more realistic teenager. I mean, there's a point later on where, you know, kind of Toji and Shinji end up striking up a friendship, and you actually get to see Shinji just like goofing around and making fun of Toji, and basically just says, hey, that was my revenge. That was my get back. We're even now, which is, you know, the kind of thing you can't even imagine kind of TV anime Evangelion Shinji even doing, because he's so kind of like in his own bubble. Whereas this Shinji feels like he's at least making the effort to put on a front. Like, it still feels very much like he's just putting on a front, but it's there, and it kind of, there's something about that feels a bit more human and a bit more balanced. And I think that's kind of the main thing that I felt the first time around reading this manga as well. And again here is just that there's a bit more to Shinji that I think makes the story move a little more easily.
Yeah, it totally does, especially with, like, you know, talking to Rei in particular, and talking to Toji and Suzuhara. I forget the nerd one. Kensuke, yeah, the otaku nerd with the minidisc video recorder, which dates this hilariously, and I love it. But yeah, as you say, I mean, I'm not trying to chalk it all up to this, but it does speak to the fact that, you know, Yoshiyuki Sakamoto is the character designer who had the character brief, and also most of this series was written and also drawn after Evangelion, the TV series, was complete, and also but as someone who was privy to the entire arc of the series. And so that's one thing, like, both as someone who is like seen it before and so knows the entire arc of Shinji and the cast, like, Sakamoto himself also knows the entire arc, and so can synthesize that into his presentations of, you know, the manga. And also in the particular, as you mentioned entirely correctly about the different angles of Shinji, is that he's not having to pull some kind of double duty where in the anime he is both the main pilot of the Evangelions and the protagonist, but he is also the forward-facing character for what Anno is doing directorially and, you know, mentally with the character and everything else that happens. And of course, once you get other characters coming into it, things kind of spread out, as it were, like the attention gets spread. But it is one of these things where, because Yoshiyuki Sakamoto has like the setting and the characters and the storyline, like, has the ability to kind of present this different character basically based on his own art or his own production of, no, I'm the character designer, this is what we've done, and this is the character as I see it. And so, you know, it does work really well with Shinji, where he's, you know, a bit snippy, a bit kind of off kilter, and also importantly, like you mentioned, like, you know, has aspects of disassociation and depression and such, but at the same time, you're still going to have moments when you're going to say something shitty or be a teen or just shrug. So you're still, and also sometimes you will in fact be slightly nicer. So, you know, it is kind of this more rounded experience rather than at least what feels like sometimes in a TV series of like, oh man, Shinji. But then again, like even in a TV series, there are plenty of moments of levity, which then of course only just made the moments of depression rather more intense. Of like, oops, I guess that thin ice papering over the cracks, to combine metaphors, was very thin, and now it has given way, and now we're all very unhappy. So
yeah. I mean, I suspect a lot of it just comes from kind of being, you know, one step removed from obviously Anno's kind of headspace making that series of like, you know, it hits all the right beats of this is what this story is about, but it also has just enough distance from kind of Sadamoto's, you know, experience of really working on the show to be able to say, yeah, but this is how it looked from my perspective. This is kind of the character you were trying to create, but, you know, I mean, especially with kind of, you know, depression and mental health issues, like your own opinion of yourself tends to be different in exactly that kind of way from how other people will see you. Like, you know, it's that typical thing of other people saying, well, he didn't seem depressed because, you know, I saw him goofing around. And it's like, you know, that external appearance versus the internal turmoil can be, you know, markedly different. So, you know, it all kind of adds up, but it is an interesting angle. And I think it's the thing that makes this manga kind of worth reading even if you're somebody who's like, I've watched the anime, I know the story. Like, if you're into the series, there's enough different here, and I recall as it goes on, like, this continues to be a thing that it's like, there's always enough that's different in this manga that it feels like you're getting your money's worth effectively.
Yeah, you definitely get like different angles on stuff, and especially on certain characters or certain storylines that, you know, had to be truncated or just curtailed because they wouldn't have made good anime or would cut for the sake of time. Like, you know, just throwaway stuff like, again, Pen and his existence and some of the banter between Ritsuko and Misato. Like, there's plenty of that in the anime, but there's different sort of stuff in this manga that kind of, you know, it's not. If it was a shot-for-shot like remake of the anime, that would be really boring, frankly, and no one really wants that. But having this be, you know, the exact same basket of tools used to fashion something slightly different is equally sort of fun to read.
I mean,
sorry,
go ahead.
Oh no, carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, one thing that I think in terms of the presentation that I feel like this manga maybe doesn't do quite so well is what is ostensibly the first episode of the series. Like, I think episode 1 of the TV series is an all-time, it's a really good way of drawing anybody into that show. Is kind of an all-time classic in terms of introducing your worlds, doing some really swift and smart kind of world building around the bare basics that you need to know. And then kind of like really getting to the crux of the matter early on. And it's really impressively kind of shot and directed. And it has some really fantastic kind of iconic visuals that kind of just like stick in your mind. And I don't know whether it's simply I suspect it's simply that it wouldn't have worked in a manga setting, but it feels like a way less interesting introduction in the manga. Like, there's far less that kind of feels really stand out and like, oh wow, like in terms of the scale of the world you see and in terms of the way the Evangelions themselves are introduced, and even in terms of like how
you just get an Evangelion turning up at the start and Shinji just going, oh, cruise missiles. It's like, how would he know that? So,
yeah. Because, I mean, that the first episode of the TV series builds so incredibly well to finally kind of, you know, the lights come on and reveal, like, this giant robot. And, you know, you get some little hints, like, before that, like, oh, there's some weird thing going on here that Shinji hasn't noticed. He's too busy sulking and reading the manual, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas here, yeah, like you say, you get straight into, like, oh, here's Unit Zero. Like, it's one of the few points in this series where it feels like very much like, oh yeah, this is the manga that came after the anime, and it's just a kind of shrug shoulders of like, you know what the robots look like, so let's get straight to it. And it just feels so much less impactful. And even when they go to Unit 1, they just take a boat. Like, you know, you think of the fantastic kind of labyrinthine kind of, you'll first look at this labyrinthine headquarters in the TV series, and, you know, it's part gag, part look how big this complex is, that kind of, you know, Misato gets lost in it and gets kind of chewed out for it. Whereas here it's just like, you know, yeah, she gets lost for a bit, but you don't really get to feel or kind of see any of that scope. And then it's just like, we're just taking a boat to the robot. And it just all feels, it feels a lot drier. Yeah. Like, it just doesn't have the kind of the zing to it that TV series has.
Yeah, it feels a lot more sort of, I mean, it's strictly chronological, which is, you know, much more boring in itself. I mean, also the first episode of Evangelion is also further, you know, made exciting by the fact that you get to episode 2 and you're now post-fight. And guess what? We get to play around with you more in episode 2 because now we're doing, immediate res basically. And that just makes the first episode even higher a point of like, oh, you're going to do all this and then drop it. And then you're going to come back to it in a way more impactful and kind of just like almost, sort of mentally assaulting kind of way of showing me what happened. So that works really well. But it doesn't really fit the tone of the manga adaptation version, especially the writing. So it becomes this very strict, like, chronological order of, oh, here is how Shinji gets introduced to the Evangelion. And it's like, this is way less interesting, but it does everything it needs to. One thing to note as well is that the manga has like the otaku stink of technical sort of otaku-dom on it, where it's not just a missile, it's a cruise missile. It's not just a thing, it's a cluster fragmentation bomb. It's not just a car or a sports car, it's my Alpine A30. It's that kind of stuff. Like, it's that kind of like clearly, it's probably like a series Bible that Sadamoto's pulling from, or just really likes using proper nouns on everything. So it does make it seem a bit more like just nerdy on its face. I can't think of a phrase for it, but it is this sort of thing you read and think, oh, okay, this is written by someone who really cares about that, I guess. Like, it doesn't really add much to the story, but I guess it's there.
Yeah. Like, some of the writing feels like it comes from, a kind of a press release from an Argos catalogue and not like actual things human beings say. Because, like, especially when you're in the middle of some kind of weird alien attack, you just say, just get in the car, not get in my Alpine A30. It's like, that's not a thing that people say, especially under duress. So yeah, there are definitely some moments of that do feel kind of really, really stilted. I guess I'm curious, like, having mentioned that opening, like, how do you feel about kind of like the artwork and the art style in general? Because I kind of go a bit back and forth on it, and I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are on it.
So I have like several pages of notes on this in my notebook because I was wrestling with it myself. So obviously the one thing that sticks out obviously is Yoshiko Sakamoto is the character designer of Evangelion, and basically is the person who has written the canonical versions of these characters. And in particular, Sadamoto's style in general and Evangelion in particular has, because Evangelion is such a big series and is very, like, the art is of its time. It is mid-90s, 80s hangover, a go-go, like, with those character designs and facial designs. Like, at times it feels Gunsmith Cats adjacent, or a very late and slightly lower budget and slightly more relaxed version of an 80s OAV, like a late 80s, early 90s OAV. Like, again, Gunsmith Cats, Bean Bandit, the Roadhog sort of stuff. That's where Yoshiki Sadamoto got his training and started drawing characters. And this feels like, for good and for ill, the distillation of that. Like, for sometimes you'll have characters with strange flat tops to their heads, or their hair will look a bit strange, or they won't move in very human ways because they're keeping to the character design structure. And, it will just look a bit off. Like, you'll think, oh, that's that character as is written as a character design, but doesn't look human and looks a bit strange. Like Misato in particular, like, I forgot how friggin' like skinny they drew her. It's like, damn girl, where'd your friggin' like guts go? But yeah, it's, the art kind of goes back and forth. I really like the fact that it's very, very limited on the use of screen tone. It uses some gradients in mouths at times, and Gendo's the only one who gets any kind of shading for most of the time, because he's a slightly darker complexion. Otherwise, it's all black and white, straight up like pen lines with like quite good use of light. So obviously that kind of pushes the lines further apart and pushes them away from characters. So you can get that feeling of stark, bright white light where the characters are shorn of that. And also, like, you can get some characters who are much more shaded in shadow because they're kind of withdrawn in, or they're in an environment. So I like that part of the art. In short, it kind of does some parts where it has like the big panel, so it shows the important panel with the detail, but doesn't work quite so well in motion. Like, I feel like some of the fights are very sort of like picture postcard, like, here is a set of file photos we took of the fight, but it's not an action scene as such. Does that make sense? But that's generally my entire thesis on the art of this is love the art, love the line work, kind of the rest of it sometimes trips over its own feet in that way.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with kind of the picture postcard comment for me, because that's kind of what I back and forth on is like, I think the artwork and the art style and, like you say, naturally the character designs look really good. And it almost at times it feels like you're flicking through kind of what is almost a collection of kind of sketches that are ready to go to be key visuals or key art in a series. And it's like, you know, there is a real kind of artistry to that is impressive. And it's impressively consistent for the most part, that like throughout, you know, it doesn't drop off and ever really get too sketchy. It always has that kind of, that sheen to it and that cleanliness to it, but it becomes too clean at some points. And yeah, I think the action scenes are where that really, really comes to the fore. I mean, like you say, sometimes it does feel unnatural and kind of, it feels like somebody's, you know, drawn a portrait where they've just asked the characters to pose rather than being kind of like, hey, here's a snapshot of this point in time and what this character's doing. It feels very posed and almost like somebody's taken a bunch of kind of Evangelion figures and is drawing them. And then like in the action scenes, yeah, like I think that really comes to the fore. Again, that first battle that Shinji has against the angel, like, in the anime, that is a really brutal and visceral and out of control fight in all kinds of ways. Like, everything about that is kind of disturbing and always feels like it's on the brink of just ending in utter catastrophe. Whereas in the manga, you kind of like, it doesn't ever feel like it has any of that brutality. Like, even when kind of limbs are being torn off or regenerating things, it just has that very kind of clean, like you say, that picture postcard feel of like, you know, here's the artist's impression of what would have happened in that moment.
Almost,
that's, you know,
sorry.
That's kind of been sanitized for, you know, like a PG audience. Like, there's nothing kind of, you know, overused word, but there's nothing visceral about it in the way that there should be for that.
Yeah, it feels almost checkboxy, which sounds really mean, but it is, like you say, when in the first fight, when the Eva has its arm broken, it's not very impressive. Like, you can kind of see that an arm is being broken, but it doesn't look like gross. Like, it can't replicate the feeling that you got when watching a TV series when you heard that awful, gross arm breaking noise and, you know, it did visual effects. Whereas in the manga, it's just, oh, arm looks a bit funny. And then when it restores the arm, it's flat out just like ding. And it's like one panel, arm restored, no real difference externally. It's very much, as I say, checkboxy of like, yep, arm done, tick. So in the action scenes, it can make it feel very, like, not flat, but a bit far too clean. As you say, far too clean when, you know, the whole point of the Evangelions is they are, you know, even at their most presentable, are gross, unwelcome beasties, things. Like, they're not, then, you know, the thing about the Evangelion is if you look at a picture of it, you think, oh, that looks cool. But then the moment you see it moving, you're like, oh, no. What are you doing? No, don't do that. That's gross. Stop that.
Yeah. And again, like, you know, the series very early on kind of plays its hand of like, this is why you feel uncomfortable seeing these creatures, because as soon as, you know, any of that armor plating drops off, like there is gross stuff going on underneath there that is not just cool, sleek robot. And I mean, even in the you know, the character design in the first place, like, they're not sleek robots. They have kind of like weird things jutting out that really seem like, you know, they serve no purpose.
They have clean lines and such, but the problem is that they have clean lines because they look, you know, they're slouched and they're kind of like individual parts look cool and clean, but the whole thing as a whole, it does look weird. Like, it's like, this isn't supposed to look like this, clearly. So, yeah.
But yeah, like, that's definitely, I'm kind of curious. I mean, I must admit, like, reading these first 3 volumes and given all the kind of Evangelion discourse ongoing has definitely me sorely tempted to just like go through and read the rest of it. And cause I sort of have vague memories that some of these issues around the artwork kind of melt away later in the series, but I don't know if that's just me getting used to it or just like me misremembering. So I'm kind of curious to, especially given how long it took to, you know, to bring this series to a conclusion, to kind of actually go through it with perhaps a more critical eye and see like how or if that stuff progresses and if it becomes kind of, you know, if it eases into some of the issues that it maybe has in these first few volumes.
Yeah, from what I remember, from not having binge read it yet, but probably going to now. But from what I remember, it gets to spend more and more time on like the same amount of content. For example, like, it spends longer. I mean, hell, from my memory, it felt like it was in End of Evangelion territory for about half of the total runtime of the manga. And it manages to go over that stuff with a fine-tooth comb, which is kind of why when it was coming out, volume by volume, chapter by chapter, it was so infuriating, because it's a case of like, you're in the home stretch. You've been in the home stretch for 5 years. Finish the goddamn manga. So, it was really wearing. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I definitely really want to revisit it for that. I mean, the other thing I will say, I don't know whether this stuff is in the individual volumes or just the omnibuses, but there's some really good interview content that is in the
individual volumes.
Okay,
that's the reason
why.
Cool, that's the reason why they're split up into 3 different parts, is because they just took the files and. So
yeah, I kind of figured, but yeah, like there's some really good stuff in there. I mean, again, it's far more kind of anime centric for the most part, but there's some good interviews with like the voice cast and so on and so forth. And there's some really good kind of like insight into the process of creating the series as well in there, which is kind of splits up the volumes quite nicely when you've got those omnibuses. But it's also a decent little treasure trove of interesting kind of little tidbits and bits of information and insight there that I quite enjoyed revisiting as well.
Volume 2 has an author's note from Sadamoto getting thirsty about plug suit cosplayers.
Oh yeah, I mean, all of Sadamoto's like end of volume notes are just kind of like, oh, please don't say anything more. Like just draw.
You're reading it and you're like, oh no, what am I doing? Yeah, it's bad. Oh dear. Yeah, but no, it's highly mixed feelings, I suppose one would say, but generally on the positive, I suppose. But yeah, fascinating to read. I would love to talk to someone who has not read somehow escaped Evangelion for this long, who then reads this first, and just to say, what do you think? Like, just tell me what you think. Like, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. If you are an alien that has picked up like the Wi-Fi signal from some overpowered router, like on some distant solar system, like please send back your thoughts on Evangelion, because you're probably the only person that can give us the answer that we seek.
We just need to find like an anime newbie and quarantine them for their own good, and then say, hey, what do you think of this? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that has been slightly tangential. That has been one of the great things about Evangelion coming to Netflix, because I have friends who are kind of like younger anime fans who they know about Evangelion like by name alone, and maybe like the character designs, and that's it. And kind of watching them go through the process. And yeah, some of the memes, but like watching them kind of like experience Evangelion for the first time, like in 2019, has been a really fascinating thing, and also kind of quite affirming in terms of like, oh yeah, this is actually genuinely a really good series, because having grown up with it as we have, like at some point you become blind to like, was this actually ever good or not? Like it's that whole thing of am I just kind of brainwashed because it was an important part of my kind of teenage years? But as it turns out, no, it is actually a genuinely good series that like a new generation of people are saying like, no, this is great. Like this is some really good stuff.
At the risk of sounding like high on my own supply, or yes, I am correct, but it is the sort of thing where if it has stuck with us for this long through all the years of us having to be adults, there's generally going to be at least a kernel of something worthwhile. I mean, there's innumerable series that when I was flicking through a DVD binder earlier, I was like, oh yeah, I watched that, and then flicked straight past it again. It's just like, oh yeah, I did watch all of Keiichi the Mighty Disciple. Not going to pick it up and put it in a DVD player, am I? But, I watched it. But am I going to talk about it on the podcast? Well, I just did. But you know what I mean? Like, it's...
Yeah,
would not have remembered it if I hadn't seen the DVDs. Whereas Evangelion is like, no, it's Evangelion. Fucking come on. So
yeah, and I think ultimately that's kind of what it comes down to this manga as well, of like for all the kind of foibles and changes and things around the periphery of it, it is still Evangelion, and it is still a really impressive and kind of powerful and well told and intriguing story that kind of just works in that medium. Like you can change stuff around, you can do whatever you like with the art style. It's still a sufficiently kind of compelling piece that actually this manga is worthwhile, because it exists off of the template of this incredibly kind of important piece of pop culture.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, that's been. Unless you had anything further, Andy?
No, I think that's it. I mean, we need to stop now. I'm just going to talk about Evangelion for like several days straight. So let's leave it.
Yeah, same. My voice is already going. So yeah, that's been Evangelion. So catch it digitally, physically, however. It's mostly available nearly everywhere. Man, if they added this to the friggin' Shonen Jump Vault, oh no. Anyway. So moving on, last thing to do for business is what we're talking about next time. So, I have nominated something a little different, to try and get away from stuff, and also I've been threatening to do this for a while. I have picked, the first volume of A Very Fairy Apartment, which is a manga published by J-Novel Club. I think the first 2 volumes are available. You can actually get the first volume of the manga separately on ebook stores, but however you want to read it, we're going to read that. Okay? It's like a 4-panel comedy manga, lots of gags. I quite like it. Well, I like it at the moment from reading the first chapter. Let's see if it stays that way. Andy, how about you?
So I'm going down my tried and tested route of somebody posted a couple of images of this on my Twitter feed and it looked cool, so I guess I'll read it. And I have picked volume 1 of Kaiju Girl and Caramelis, which
I'm glad you pronounced that,
looks
not
cool.
me.
So, I mean, I may not pronounce it right. Like, please send in corrections.
Oh,
but, yeah,
that's what that word is. Okay, I've seen this cover before, but I couldn't figure out how to pronounce it.
Yeah. So yeah, we will have fun pronouncing that and hopefully reading it for the next episode.
So, thank you very much. This has been Screentone Club. If you like the podcast, please think about telling a friend, tweet about it, at us on Twitter, at Screentone Club. Ratings and reviews on your podcatcher feed app thing of choice is very greatly appreciated. It really helps get us in front of people to expand the audience. If you did like this, maybe think about tracking us a few bucks via Patreon at patreon.com/Screentone Club. You can also email us at show@screentone.club. And myself, I am Elliot Page. You can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter, posting more cat pictures, I hope. You will also find my personal site at moash.it, which I have just remade, so it doesn't have so many broken links anymore. Stupid me. And Andy, how about you?
Yep, I am Andy Hanley, and you can find me promising not to talk too much more about Evangelion at Hannah's1979.
Aces. So, thank you very much for listening, and we'll speak to you, well, in another 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.